Welcome to a new episode of the Geopolitical Puzzle. For this new episode, my guest is Clint Azzopardi Flores. Clint Azzopardi Flores is an economist from Malta. He has worked in Brussels, Belgium, representing the Maltese Government. In 2018, Azzopardi Flores was appointed ambassador to the Political and Security Committee of the European Union, where he held the position for 4 years. During his tenure, he witnesses different crises, including the Libyan and Syrian crisis, the negotiation of the European Peace Facility, and the negotiations of the new military mission, Operation Irene. In this episode, we will discuss the geopolitical implications of the Mediterranean Sea migrant crisis. Hello, Clint. How are you?
Hello, Juan Carlos. How are you?
Oh, I am doing well. Thank you so much, and thank you for your time, because we're going to discuss in this second episode of the Geopolitical Puzzle a very interesting topic, crucial from the geopolitical perspective. It's about the migratory crisis in the Mediterranean Sea. Clint, on April 13, the United Nations Human Rights Chief Volker Türk expressed alarm at the precarious situation of asylum seekers and migrants attempting to cross the central Mediterranean, and called for combined efforts to ensure their swift rescue and dignified, effective, and thorough processing at the safe location. To get into the context, Clint, in your opinion, what caused the Mediterranean refugee crisis?
Juan Carlos, firstly, thank you for inviting me. Frankly, I was a little bit surprised that my Malta Business Weekly column made it to Boston. And to add a little bit of context, let's give some information. Historically, migration from the North Africa, especially from Libya, it's not a new phenomenon. It's since the 1950s, and North Africa held an important position as a destination for refugees and migrants from North Africa. However, the refugee crisis has been lingering for quite a long time now. And in 2015, we had a lot of tragedies. The Mediterranean Sea became literally a cemetery because there was a surge in crossings, over 1 million crossings to reach Europe, and for that reason we had a problem because the higher the number, the higher the deaths. The Central Mediterranean route, it's quite dangerous, and it's not just the Central Mediterranean route. There is also the Western Mediterranean route, and there is also an Eastern Mediterranean route that has become really dangerous also to cross. Technically, after the Arab Spring in 2011, it was easier to understand the complexity of the situation, partly because engagement with transit countries, like for instance Libya, became easier to understand what is happening on the ground after autocratic governments. They were overthrown by the people. So therefore, it opened the window to understand what is actually happening on the ground. Between 2011 and 2014, which coincided with the first and the second civil wars in Libya, refugees and migrants started to increasingly arrive via boat from Libya, especially to Italy. There are other routes, as I said, the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Mediterranean, and as I said, there were already 1.1 million crossings at the time from the Central and Eastern route. So the majority of the crossings were also related to fleeing the war, including the one that was happening also in Syria. So technically, that was what constituted the refugee crisis. Recently, we saw also refugees and asylum seekers crossing, which is one of the deadliest routes. The Central Mediterranean route and the Eastern are two of the deadliest, to be honest.
That's impressive. I when I was doing my research, I noticed that since 2000, there are stats that since 2014, over 26,000 people have died or
Yes.
gone missing, crossing the Mediterranean, including, all the Central Mediterranean, the West Mediterranean, etc. And I didn't know that it's considered among the most dangerous migration routes in the world. So
Yes.
for this episode, I read an internet from a page info migrants says that since the beginning of just this year 2023, Clint, the number of migrants arriving on Italian shores has been increasing steadily every month. For example, in January, almost 5,000, February, 9,000, March, 30,000, April, 40,500, and so on. My question is Italy the main destiny of the refugees, correct? If so, why is that?
Depends how one examines the numbers, Juan Carlos. There are other destinations, as I said, from the eastern Mediterranean coast. They want to arrive to Greece, they want to arrive to Cyprus, and now even to Bulgaria. So mostly they also leave from Turkey. So they are also receiving a substantial number of migrants there. However, from the central Mediterranean route, perhaps when you see it on its own, it could be that yes, Italy is receiving a lot of numbers from the central Mediterranean route because they mostly leave from the points of Tripoli and close to Tripoli to Tunisia, which
I see.
obviously reaches mostly the Italian coast because there is an island just under the cusp between Tunisia and Libya,
Hmm.
which is called Lampedusa, a tiny island closer to the North African coast, which is closer to North Africa other than Malta. So technically, once they enter into their the area, their part where they can
They
call for
closer.
rescue, yes, it's the closest, safest port where you can bring migrants in.
Mhm.
So that is why they are receiving most of the numbers. And this is the reason why there was also a visit recently by some of the European also heads and state of governments in north of Africa, including Tunisia.
Let's continue this conversation about Italy, Clint, since this country is always in the news, right? Because of the crisis. You published a very interesting article on the Malta Business Weekly titled Borrell's Oversleeping Child Irene. You mentioned that Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni stated that Italy must work on breaking smugglers, models, and human trafficking roads. What are those roads and who are involved?
Well, this is really a composite situation, Juan Carlos. Like you have smugglers and human traffickers exploiting human beings that are trying to find refuge and fleeing wars or persecution. So they are actually profiteering out of other people's misfortunes, and migrants smugglers have developed significantly since the migration crisis unfolded back in 2015. So the business increased. Over 90% of illegal migrants or irregular migrants, as we say, it's not the technical word is irregular migrants, paid smugglers to try to reach Europe. And according to Europol and Interpol, they certainly paid money to make it to, especially to Libya. This is high, I mean, to Tripoli, to closer to shore so that they can cross. So technically, this is a highly lucrative business for criminal networks. And there is a low risk of many of them getting caught because Libya, especially, and other territories under the Sahel and above the Sahel region, is a massive territory which the borders at times are not supervised. So it is estimated that migrant smuggling generated between 3 to 6 billion turnover in 2015 and over 200 million in 2019 in the maritime routes, leading, especially mostly, not leading mostly, leading to the European Union. So technically, the EU has taken decisive actions to target criminal networks that exploit vulnerable migrants, and recently, between 2022 and 2025, the European Union set up the European Multidisciplinary Platform against criminal threats. So this is one of the priorities to fight against the facilitation of irregular migration. and it was set for the period 2022 and 2025. Having said this, there were also member states that pushed for arrests. There were around 3,400 arrests and almost 2,300 investigations and seizure of cash, almost 1 million, and 159 firearms, because they're obviously armed criminal organization, and hundreds of fraudulent documents. So the European Council back then agreed as well, in the European Union, to push for the fight against illegal smuggling. It's like human trafficking, actually.
Mhm. Clint, to combat traffickers, the European Union currently deploys operations, through the whole Mediterranean Sea to rescue migrants at risk and fight also, as you mentioned, against migrant smuggling. And one of these deploys is the Irene operation that you mentioned also in your article. Can you explain to the audience what is or was Operation Irene and why it is essential in this crisis?
The council back then in 2020, in March 2020, launched a military operation called Operation Irene. This operation aims technically to contribute to also the disruption of the business model of human smuggling and trafficking networks through information gathering and patrolling by planes in the Mediterranean region. So technically, Operation Irene, they have also this task to also execute, and its predecessor, because Operation Irene succeeded Operation Sophia,
Mhm.
which was also founded by back then the High Representative Federica Mogherini, which was deployed from May 2015 to March 2020 because of the consequence of the refugee crisis and the tragedies that unfolded in the Mediterranean Sea, which we were mentioning earlier. So during this period, the operation contributed to arrests of suspected smugglers, the destruction of around 550 boats, and most importantly, out of this, through Operation Sophia, and then it was also handed over to Operation Irene, there was the training of the Libyan Coast Guards.
Mhm.
So technically, the Libyan Coast Guards, especially in Tripoli, they were being given training on how to handle the rescue at sea. So to try to save lives at sea. So that was quite important because it trained almost over 480 Libyan Coast Guards. So that is one of the most important tasks that the military operation, the mission, had to execute beyond also the arms embargo, the United Nations arms embargo, and also the fuel smuggling from Libya. So technically, it contributed to also train the coast guards, which helped in reducing the losses of lives at sea as well.
That's interesting. Both operations did a great job.
Indeed, and the one as I said, Operation Sophia seized in March 2020. I was still in the Political and Security Committee of the EU at that time, and I was there to also be part of the negotiations. So technically, I saw even the war between Benghazi and Tripoli at that time, between General Haftar and Sarraj on one side, and even Turkey entered into Tripoli to bring the balance of power to fight also, because there were also some Russians, Wagner group operating in the eastern part of Libya. So Turkey helped Tripoli to bring back the balance of power because they had better air capabilities, including drones called Bayraktar TB2, which were tested, I think, also during this war. But yes, the refugees were fleeing also because of the result also of the war. They didn't want to stay in Libya, caught in such a situation, fleeing war from their country of origin and then fleeing war from the transit country as well.
Clint, we know that this crisis, the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean, will involve geopolitics, certainly, right? This situation is very complex. and different institutions, play different roles as well, including governments, international organizations, the European Union itself, etc. Under your viewpoint, how is this crisis affecting the countries around the Mediterranean from the geopolitical perspective? We are talking about pretty much 20 countries in the whole Mediterranean, right? What are the implications or risk?
In all honesty, it's not affecting just the Mediterranean countries, Juan Carlos. I think here we must be careful now because inflation is impinging on many economies and pinching people's pockets. So, if you look at the recent Eurobarometer survey, I was surprised to see an increase in the concern of migration into Europe by Europeans. So, there tends to be a correlation between economic uncertainty and also far right politics. So the narrative must change to one that migrants are not to blame for the economic mishaps of different crises. So technically, last weekend we had the Dutch government, which was one of the longest. Prime Minister Mark Rutte served for almost 13 years there, and he resigned. He retired from politics because he couldn't agree also on the process of asylum seekers, which they saw a surge in the number of asylum seekers, and the coalition parties were not agreeing to what was being proposed. So far right politics in Europe is increasing, and I believe that in the next European Parliament elections next year in 2024, if not mitigated, we would see an increase in the number of seats occupied, hopefully not, by far right and populist parties. So the current EU Commission, I think they must do more in the coming months to alleviate the problems of inflation, but also adjusting perhaps their multi-annual financial framework, which is the EU budget framework for 7 years, and become more aggressive perhaps on subsidies, especially to transit to the greener transition economy, especially for the advancement of all the factors of the environmental social governance, because companies are also incurring additional costs, and these costs are being easily adjusted, and because of flexibility of the free market, passed on to consumers. So technically, I think it's not affecting just the Mediterranean. Mark Rutte was with the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni in Tunisia 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago to see whether, as you mentioned it earlier in your questions, whether the processing of asylum seekers could be carried out in one of the North African countries, especially to avoid some deadly crossings in the Mediterranean from the central Mediterranean route, especially.
Clint, is there anything that you would like to add to this conversation? Perhaps, I don't know, if you would like to, share a little bit what is the Malta position or what is your personal position as a, as an expert or a professional who work in this or know this field, currently write articles about it. Is there anything that you would like to add?
I think what we need to keep an eye on is what is happening in the eastern also part of Europe, because that is affecting the war in Ukraine has become a protracted war, and its global implications are triggering additional crises elsewhere, including Africa. At this stage, I think Ukraine needs additional assistance to be able to resist the aggressor, perhaps end this war. However, it might take longer to achieve a long lasting peace. And if you allow me, I take this opportunity to appeal to find an honest broker who can seriously broker a ceasefire and perhaps a peace agreement. From the Maltese government side, and I think the Maltese government is doing a lot, even when it comes to the Mediterranean part as well. Malta's prime minister was also in Libya and also in Tunisia this last week, also proposing to have a green energy hub in the Mediterranean region, also from these countries, perhaps to aid also the problem of the energy crisis that we had last year in Europe from after the sanctions that were imposed on the Russian gas, which then eventually Europe started weaning itself of Russian gas. So technically, I think Malta did its part as well, because we have been speaking as well on the deadliest routes of the Mediterranean region, and perhaps even from my perspective, I think that working together, it's important because no country can solve this problem on its own, but it's like countries coming together, like Malta, Italy, and other countries, and the European Union, to at least make sure that we avoid any tragedies like the ones we had in 2015, which were really, really tragic.
I totally agree with you. As you mentioned, all the countries involved, like let's see, Turkey, the Balkans, Italy itself, Malta, Cyprus, Greece, they have to work together to combat this or to fight against this trafficker or avoid, as you said, more deaths in the sea. Clint, where can people contact you?
People can reach me, and the public can reach me by email on clint@clintflores.com. So if they would like further information, or if they would like to follow also my weekly column on the Malta Business Weekly, which is a weekly column on a Thursday, and I would like to thank you for inviting me for this podcast, which I really and sincerely appreciated. And it was so nice of you to actually invite me, which I was surprised to from Malta to make it to Boston, to be honest.
Thank you so much, Clint. This topic of the migratory crisis in the Mediterranean Sea is very broad and complex. So if more people talk about it, about this issue, we can create more awareness and try to find the right solution. Hey, thank you so much for your time, Clint.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. I wish you all the success in your podcasts, and hopefully you will be growing more audience through this podcast. Perhaps people get more interested on getting to know what is happening around the world. So perhaps you grow your audience further through these new podcasts.
Thank you so much, Clint. I am Juan Carlos Giraldo from Boston, United States. Thank you so much to everyone.